Some time ago, Michelle and I were at Cincinnati, and I forget, I think it's the Arnoff Center, Procter and Gamble building, and they have a lot of musicals there. And Lily in the back was giving me a spiel about the difference between a musical, a play, and to never, ever, ever say stage show. So a musical, okay? I'm at a musical, and we're watching Les Mis, and we're there, and that's not Les Mis. If you got a picture, don't worry about that yet. So we're watching Les Mis, and I'm kind of a neurotic guy. Like if I'm sitting, I can't sit still. If I'm sitting down, my leg's doing this or something like that, or I'm fidgeting in some way, just very neurotic like that. So we're there, we're watching this. It's super engaging. As soon as the first note hits, you're just hooked. It's an amazing production. So we're 3/4 of the way through, and I notice that we're shaking. And I'm like, oh, I got to stop that. I'm probably bothering the people. And I look down, and I'm fine. And I'm just watching the show, and I'm like, we're shaking. Like this whole entire row is bouncing. So I look over, and Michelle is in tears. And she's laughing so hard, it's shaking. And I'm like, we're experiencing this totally different right now. You know, this is a totally different experience, but she's shaking like crazy. Well, anyway, we're hooked on the musicals. So we go back a couple of months later to the Phantom of the Opera, and it is a phenomenal production. And we're like, we love this dynamic. This is just super, super cool. So we're so hooked that we actually reach out to this guy, this particular Phantom. His name's Gary Maurer. We reach out to this guy, and we're like, hey, this was amazing. Just thank you. He had a little fan club. We're like, hey, can we be part of this fan club or whatever? So he reaches back out and gets us some really cool tickets. He's like, hey, come back to the show. I'll get you some really cool tickets, and then meet me at the stage door, and I'll give you a tour behind the scenes. So we're like, oh, yeah, come on. So we drive back up, go to the second production, just as good. Then we go to the stage door. He takes us around back, and it is a phenomenal experience. If you've ever been to that particular theater, it's gorgeous. But what's super cool is that we were behind the scenes. And he's taking us and showing us this different stuff. He's still in costume, partially, and he's taking this prosthetic off. And it's just like glued to his face because, you know, when he removes the mask, it's abominable, right? So he's removing this thing, and it's like jiggly, like Jello kind of, just like blah, 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 pull it off like that. And he tosses it on the table, and I'm like, dude, can I have that? Like, oh my gosh, what a souvenir. And he was like, there's no way I could give that to you. Everything here is so red taped, I would get in trouble if I offered that to you. I'm like, all right. So he takes us on this tour and shows us how kind of all these trapped scenes work. We get this, if you know the musical, we get to see that monkey that's clapping. It's just great. And then he takes us out to the curtain. He says, okay, just stand on the stage and look out. And I remember standing on stage looking out thinking, wow, when you're behind the scenes, you get a totally different view. And it's so cool to have a point person who's able to say, here's what you need to take a look at. Or let me show you this. Or this is how things work behind the scenes. Here is the best view. When you think about discipleship, and this is a series called Called, but it's disciples who make disciples. And we'll get into that word called next week. But for right now, when you have someone who's able to show you something behind the scenes, pull back the curtain and allow you to experience, it just makes it so much more meaningful. And I think that's what this guy named the Apostle Paul does. He's able to pull back the curtain and say, hey, I know my way around this. I know my way around this spiritual theater. And I want you to take a look at this and check this out. And then I want you to stand here. And this is just the best view. So this series is all about one of those emerging things that's really important here at Madison Hills, which is discipleship. And just so you know, that suffix ship at the end of the word, it means like a skill, or it can mean a skill. And it also can mean like a state of being. So you're good at something, you develop this skill, and then it's part of who you are. It's where you reside, what you're about, and what you do. So it's a skill and a state. And that's true for the word discipleship. It becomes this skill that we get better and better at. Better at being a disciple, and even better at making a disciple. And it's also that state of being as followers of Jesus Christ. So we're going to spend 2 weeks, this morning and next week, looking at what it means to be a disciple, and the following 2 weeks, what it means to make a disciple. And we're going to walk through Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, what we know as Philippians, because I think this book is one of those books that you don't automatically go to when you think of discipleship. But when you read through Philippians, you get the impression that Paul's like, oh, I'm the guy who can take you on a tour of what discipleship really looks like. And I can take you behind the scenes and show you what's really important and how this thing works. Sound good? All right, so when we come to chapter 1, and Philippians is a really interesting book. It's not like some of his letters. Maybe if you've been around the Bible for a while and you know some of the letters that Paul wrote, there's one that he wrote called Galatians, and he starts out like, you foolish Galatians. Like, it's not a hard letter. You read through Philippians, and there's not this huge problem or this huge issue that Paul is tackling. Instead, it's kind of an intimate letter where he's coming alongside of these people and helping them sort out some of the most valuable content of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, showing us the way, if you will. So he comes and he says, hey, I've got a prayer for you. This is chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. My prayer for you all is that your love will abound more and more. And you can start to see hints of how discipleship is taking root in the initial verses. You might call it sanctification, where you become a follower of Jesus, and now the goal is the rest of your life to grow in conformity to what it means to follow Jesus in his teaching. Or you might call it spiritual formation or spiritual growth. We're going to call it discipleship. So his prayer is that your love that you have, that you're having for this God and the people that you see that follow him, this love, my prayer is that it grows more and more, but that it grows in knowledge and depth of insight. And don't you love that language? And you can see it happening. It's not just stagnant. It doesn't just start and then stop. It's to abound more and more. And you grow and you develop in knowledge and depth of insight. You'll remember from several series ago, right? Several series ago, the word disciple actually means that capacity and or willingness to really think through what the message of Jesus means to us and how it's immediately applicable to our lives. So his prayer is that this love begins to grow more and more. It's abounding in knowledge and depth of insight, but it doesn't end there. There's going to be 2 more words that are vastly important. And when these 2 words are introduced into a statement or a sentence, what happens is what precedes these words is the setup for the intended outcome that flows after these 2 words. So his prayer is that the love abounds more and more. It continues to grow in knowledge and depth of insight. Next verse. So that you're able to discern what is best. And I have to tell you, I think that's one of the biggest missing pieces in being a follower of Jesus. It's like it's so easily overlooked that following Jesus includes a clear calculation of what is best in any given moment. In the moment I'm in right now, in the circumstances I'm in right now, when you and I leave this property and we go back into our lives and maybe some of the details that no one else is aware of or sees, what does the message of Jesus mean in that setup? How do I think through this? How do I apply? How do I make sure I'm focused on what is best? And when you read through Philippians, you get the impression that best sometimes for us is it's like this technical thing. But when you read through Philippians, you see that what is best isn't always technical, but it's painfully practical. You know, when you think technical, who uses Siri? You ever get frustrated at her? I mean, we live in an age when we're talking to our phone and you're not on the phone with anyone. Do you ever say thank you to Siri when she gives you directions? Yeah. Do you ever ask her how her day's going? Do you ever get mad at her when she's not following what you're saying? Yeah. So the other day I'm in Michelle's Prius and it's hooked up to the car and everything. So I'm saying, hey Siri, I'm going up north to a little small town that was beautiful, St. Thomas. Never been there before. It was a gorgeous town, but I didn't know how to. Fort Thomas. Yeah. See, I've never been there before. It was gorgeous. So I'm like, hey Siri, directions to Fort Thomas. And she plugs it in and I'm leaving Lexington. And she was like, okay, stay in the second lane from the left. You know from last week, I don't like to do that, right? So she was like, stay in the second lane from the left. But I know this stretch of road I'm on. I'm like, oh, technically she's right. Like I get the directions. I get where she's leading me. But I know this stretch of road. And I know that if I stay here, I'm going to miss my opportunity to actually get over and make the move I need to make. This is a very congested area. Technically, she's right, but practically, I know there's a best way to do this. And that's what Paul wants to align his readers around right off the bat. My prayer, yes, your love grows and grows in knowledge and depth of insight, but not just for that purpose, so that you can discern what is best in any given moment. Now, why is this important? Paul's in prison. He's in prison when he's writing this letter. So you and I have a natural transfer. There's a natural segue from this letter to our lives, especially if you're in a season of life where things aren't going the way they should. Life is not firing on all 8 cylinders. Life is tough in the moment. You're sorting some stuff out. Well, so was he. So what does this gospel message mean? Practically. And how do you discern what is best? Now here's why this is important. This isn't just original with Paul. And it's not me just reaching out there and saying, okay, we talk about discipleship a lot. We need something fresh. How do we spin it? Can we talk about something that we haven't heard before? This actually originates with Jesus. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke. This comes from Luke chapter 10. You don't have to follow along. We're going to read it to you. This is Luke chapter 10, and it's a familiar story, especially if you've been around church for a while, where Jesus is interacting with 2 ladies, Martha and Mary. And he says something. He says 2 things that just jump off the page when you're thinking about Paul's idea of discipleship and disciples learning about what's best. So just a few verses, and here's how it goes. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And she had a sister called Mary. And the sister Mary, she sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha, she was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. Can't you hear this story saying, oh, what she's doing is good? And when you look at this story contextually, she probably did have some stuff that she needed to tend to. And it was good. Or maybe you can even take it a step farther and say, what she was doing was even better than some people in comparable situations were doing. Like she's really focused. And she's responsible. And she's very technical. But what happens next? So she's distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. So she came to Jesus and she said, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And notice Jesus' response. He says, oh, Martha. And I don't know his tone. I assume it was something like, Martha, Martha, or maybe something else. The Lord answered, you're worried and you're upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Listen to this. Mary has chosen what is best, and it will not be taken from her. She has chosen what is best, and in doing so, even if no one else understands it, that's not going to be taken from her. Now, the word best, it has this connotation of being able to understand why this option or this choice or this discernment is different, and in being different, why it's superior. For example, when I first came down here to Richmond, I was told early on that there's kind of an issue that we have to sort out. Now, I haven't really seen it playing out too much. I've heard it in conversations. I've heard some people make reference to it, and I'm like, when do I step in and actually address that? I'm the lead pastor here, and I just can't let this develop into any tension. But I was told early on, and Sean Hamilton told me this, so if you've got a problem with what I'm about to say, see, not me, but see Sean after the sermon. But he said, there's kind of a division at Madison Hills Christian Church, and it's indicative of a larger division kind of in Richmond, where there's Casa Fiesta people, and then there's Nuevo people, right? So I've been to both, and I went to Casa Fiesta, and I'm like, this is really good. Nice atmosphere. It's great. Food was great. Then several weeks ago, Tommy Masters and I went to Nuevo, and I'm walking up to the door, and I'm like, Casa, Casa hands down. So we go in, and I look to the right, and I look to the left, and it's massive. There's land and hills and goats and all kinds of, wherever you look, it just goes on and on and on. And we sit down, and the food and the service, the style, it was phenomenal. So I want you to know that as Madison Hills moves forward, we're a Nuevo kind of people, okay? We're a Nuevo kind of people. That's who we are, part of our DNA, okay? But you're able to decide, just like Mary, why this is different. And in being different, it's superior to what is good and even what is better. It's best. It's best. So Jesus says when you decide and you land on best, that's not going to be taken from you. In other words, I can hear Jesus saying, he's going to nurture that. He's going to help facilitate that and lead you down that direction. So Paul comes along and says, my prayer is that this idea of love, it abounds, it grows into knowledge and depth of insight so that you're able to distinguish why things are different and what's best. That's a really big deal. So several years ago, there was a church. We talked a little bit about this in Bob's class. By the way, if you haven't been to Bob's Sunday school class, phenomenal study on discipleship, and the discussion going on there is fantastic, and there's really good traction going on. So I'd invite you. We're going to extend it 3 more weeks, 3 more Sundays with this particular focus. So you can jump in. You're not too late to the game, but you can jump in, and it'll be a benefit to you if this is clicking in your life. It'll be a very good help for you. So a lot of good practical stuff. But we were talking about this church that did a study, kind of like an internal audit, and they realized that something tragic was happening in their church. There was no moral failure, nothing with money or finances, and the church wasn't declining in numbers. They were actually growing. And one weekend, they actually grew by 1,000 people. And they started discussing, when we send funds into certain programs or community initiatives or ways of developing disciples, how is that money being allocated and what's happening? And they walked away from this study, and they actually wrote a book about it called the Reveal Study. It was a thriving church up north, and they walked away with this understanding. There's probably 4 categories of people, and I bet it would be really interesting for me to see where each of you feel that you fit into these categories. But they said what the Reveal Study did for us is help us understand that the new people, like pre-Christians, they were calling them, people with questions about Christianity, that they really don't have a solid or, if any, church background. Just never went to VBS as a kid. Their parents never took them, really didn't live close to a church. So this church dynamic that you and I are kind of used to, or maybe even comfortable with, they've got questions. They're exploring what Christianity means, the belief system, and then what it means for their lives. This church realized that they were doing a fantastic job meeting these people exactly where they were. They were killing it with them. That's why their church, grew in one weekend by 1,000 people. But then they realized that there's a jump when those people who are seeking or exploring take that step of faith and say, yes, I want to surrender my life to Jesus. And they become a new Christian or a disciple, a freshly made disciple, a follower of Jesus. That's a big jump. And they realized that when it comes to discipleship, though, they had dropped the ball. They were great with the question marks, but when it comes to new Christians, they dropped the ball. And then they took a look and it's like, it's not only new, people are growing, and then they grow into being Christ-centered So what happens? And that's a question that I want to pose to us, not to be answered this morning. And I want it to be a lingering question that you have. And when we wrap this series up and 3 weeks down the road, I want to come back to this question. But the question is, how do you? And how does Madison Hills, and this is one of the purposes of the study and the study on Sunday mornings in our Sunday school class, how we're wrapping our minds around this idea of discipleship. Because how do you take a person who is exploring to a fully engaged follower of Jesus? And the question for me is, how is Madison Hills going to do that as we move forward? Well, one of the interesting things they had in this study was when they made that leap from exploring to new Christian, they realized one of the best things you can do is help those new Christians begin to become responsible for their own faith, so that they're not dependent upon anyone else except the Holy Spirit and the Word of God. So they become self-feeders. Their faith, their personal growth, their spiritual formation, their discipleship is not just important in a group setting, but it's important to them. And that's one of the catalysts that help those new Christians become growing Christians, and then eventually Christ-centered Christians. So this is what Paul would say as he moves on in chapter 1. My prayer is that love, it's growing, it's abounding in your knowledge, your depth of insight, so that you're able to discern what is best in any given situation for you. And then Paul says, for me, I'm in prison, I get it. And I'm actually thinking, these are his words, you read toward the end of chapter 1, he was like, I'm thinking, I may lose my life. And if I do, I'm kind of curious, which is even better? And then he drops this line, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So Paul had moved on from that exploring to new, to growing, to Christ-centered, so that he could say, my life, for me living, it's Christ-centered. It's Christ. And to die, since it's Christ-centered, well, that's gain as well. That's powerful. And one of the things you'll notice as we work through these 4 chapters of Philippians, if you've got a little bit of a working background with church, Philippians is one of those letters where a lot of common language that we use in churches, you'll see that, that's where that comes from. That's where that's at in the Bible. A lot of very, very familiar statements and words and sentences in this book, and that's one of them. For me to live is Christ, and die is gain. Now, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a couple of practical things you can start doing with as you're discerning what's best. Here's a couple of meaningful metrics that you can use for yourself, and I use them too, so I know they're beneficial. You can use these as well, and you see them in Paul's letter, especially chapter 1 here. A couple of meaningful metrics you can use to see if you're progressing as a follower of Jesus. If that love that you have is growing more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, and if you're beginning to discern what is not good and not even better, but what is best. And number 1 is how you relate to yourself. How you relate to yourself and what is going on in your world. So when Paul writes this letter, I told you he's in prison. And he actually drops this line as he's sorting through some of those details to this church, and he says, I've realized being in prison's hard, but it's actually serving to advance the gospel message. That's not an explorer. That's not even a new follower. That's someone who's over time really discerned what is best. And they've developed this idea of how to work in their own heart and mind. And what this message means, so that when rough times come your way, it doesn't knock you off balance. It doesn't level you, and you never fall into that trap of, if there's a God or if there is a God that is good, why is this bad happening to me? You reach that moment to where you realize that the bad stuff God can use for good, because after all, this isn't our message. It's his message. And this church isn't our idea. It's his idea. So what's going on with Paul? He's like, this is actually being used to advance the gospel, to move his purposes forward. That's a metric you can use. Like, where are you? Don't answer out loud. But where are you with that? What happens in your life? You ask, myself, how is discipleship playing out? How do I engage it? How do I embrace it? What's best in any given scenario, especially difficult stuff? The second one is how you're responding to others. Paul writes in this letter, and he identifies that there's actually some people, and you can see them. I was going to put up an image, and I was like, no, that might actually defeat the purpose. But there's people in the world that want to push a message of Jesus, and that you and I, if we've been around church for a while, we'll see, you know what, that's kind of a partial gospel. That's not a complete version of what we're talking about. And then there's some people who are very antagonistic about it. And I'm sure we could share our stories of names we know about people who were money grabbing when it comes to serving a church. And there's often big names, and then something breaks down and it was just all about money. It wasn't anything else to actually do with the mission of a local church. You know, we know those names. Well, Paul reaches a moment to where he was like, I realize that happens. Not just in the 21st century world that you and I live in, but in the first century world. And he's sorting through that. And it might be good at times to identify that. And depending on the severity of the situation, it might even be better to really identify that. But notice what Paul says. That happens. People preach Christ. Sometimes out of envy, sometimes out of rivalry. But the important thing is that amazing, beautiful name of Christ is preached. It's elevated. It's exalted. And that's kind of true. Even if people are doing it in vanity, the name is so powerful that in doing it in vanity, it's still lifted high. It's still proclaimed. It's still preached. And that's how he lands. So you think about you, and I think about me, and how I interact with other people. That's a great metric to understand. Am I growing as a follower of Jesus? Is this discipleship taking root? Am I discerning what is best? You know, several years ago, I was invited to serve in a role called the Director of Discipleship and Teaching. And I loved the role. And I found myself seated around a table of some other leaders and my particular predecessor for this role. And we're seated around this table, and we had some information that my predecessor had brought to the table, and we were talking through it. And then it reached a moment as this individual was stepping away from this position that I was about to assume. It reached a moment and where the mood just shifts. You know what I'm talking about? You ever been in a room and there's a vibe, and then somebody just says something, and then boom, it just shifts. Well, that happened. And it tilted toward this negative energy. And then I just listened to this individual start to rail against the leadership. And then to make suggestions about what should happen if there was going to be any success moving forward. And I'm listening to this thinking, you're leaving. Like, why in the world would you respond to yourself and to others in this manner? So it just did not go well. The individual leaves, some time goes in, I step into the role, we move forward with discipleship and what it means in our teaching, and it reaches a moment in time for me to step away from the position. And I have to tell you that in stepping away, I heard this young man who had stepped away prior to me, I heard his words. And in that moment, some of the things he said resonated with me. But then reality checked me, and I found myself in a similar situation and thought, I'm remembering that several years later. There's going to be a point in time where I'm remembering something or somebody's remembering me several years in the future. And I find myself stepping away from this position just like he did, and I said, time out. I'm going to do this totally different. So I don't know if you know this about me or not, but I cook a really good lasagna. Do you know that? Okay, it's Paula Dean's recipe, but I've come to master it. Okay, it's really good. So I'm like, here's what we're going to do. At the very next big staff meeting, which will be my last, I'm going to cook a couple of lasagnas. And we usually cater food at this particular place. I'm going to cook lasagna, cater it myself, and then I'm going to sit down with a pad of paper and an ink pen, and I'm going to write down every name of the staff that I work with, our team, and there was about 15 or 16 of us, and I'm going to write down what they're good at and how they've been valuable to me. And then I'm going to buy each of them a very personalized gift, and I'm going to wrap it in that brown paper with twine. So that's what I do. And I call attention to them, and we have lasagna. It's great. I have to reveal it's not mine, it's Paula Dean's, and I always hate doing that, but it is Paula Dean's. And then I call everybody up one by one, and I share a little bit about them, and then I give them this gift. Just as a side note, I don't know if she still does it or not, I haven't looked. But at this particular place, Hunter was actually part of that team. And she would go shoeless when she led worship. She would take her shoes off and just be around in socks. And I thought, I bet they get worn out. So I got her a big bag of socks, just there you go. And there were personalized gifts for that. And I tell you that not to, put emphasis on me. I tell you that because I can stand here right now in this moment and tell you that and be so free because of learning how to interact with myself and others. But it comes from allowing love to abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that at any given moment, you can discern what is best. That's a characteristic of a growing disciple, and it's so easily overlooked. Father, we thank you for what you're doing here in the hearts and minds of everyone who makes up Madison Hills Christian Church. And I pray that as we move forward in this series, Father, your name is lifted high. Your purposes are clearly understood, and it's clearly understood how to move those forward. And I pray, Father, that there's an increased awareness, not just of love and knowledge and depth of insight, but an increased awareness of how to identify what is best and move forward with that. Because that's what you're going to nourish. And you're not going to allow that to be taken away. So, Father, for moments like these, we praise you, where we're together. And we're together with the message, with the word, with your spirit. And we allow you to do things in our hearts and minds that help us grow. And in doing so, you're also growing your church. And for that, we praise you. And as we move forward, Father, give us awareness even later today or throughout this week of how we can choose what is best when we're interacting with ourselves and with others. And to that end, we pray and praise you in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.